Welcome to Liverpool, where Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is preparing to address his party's annual conference. This is Politics Live. My guest today, Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reed. The Guardian's North of England editor, Helen Pidd. Times columnist Patrick Maguire and the Mayor of Liverpool, Steve Rotheram. Today, Sir Keir Starmer will set out a decade-long plan to transform Britain, including a pledge to build the next generation of new towns.
After 13 years of the Conservatives, it's going to take time to turn things round. He is levelling with the public here.
It could be his last speech before a general election and a chance to set out his vision.
The question is, what do you think Sir Keir Starmer stands for?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Well, that is why this week is so important for us. We come here to this, the last conference before a general election, to set out our positive case.
We'll be discussing what we can expect from the speech and asking if it'll be enough to convince undecided voters. Yes, it's a big day here in Liverpool at the Labour Party conference. We've got loads of delegates surrounding the studio and the stage here, our makeshift studio for the week at conference, and everyone is very welcome. Of course, the big set piece is Sir Keir Starmer's speech to everyone who is gathered here. And they'll be waiting to hear what the leader has to say in terms of a vision from the country, presenting himself as a future Prime Minister and the Labour Party as a government in waiting. People are flooding in, you can see there just outside this exhibition hall, to take their place before Sir Keir Starmer stands up at about 2 o'clock. We're expecting his speech. We will have another programme on Politics Live this afternoon to cover his speech live and uninterrupted. But let's talk to our guests first of all. Welcome to all of you. What's resting on this speech today, Steve? What's resting on this speech today?
Well, this is, as Keir was saying, this is his chance and our party's chance to really start to put some flesh on the bones about what a Labour government would mean and how we can start to tackle those huge problems that this country faces after 13 years of decline under the Conservatives, where for so many people everything feels broken.
Helen, what do you think rests on this speech?
Well, the result of next year's general election is what rests on it. I mean, what I'm hoping to see from it is I want to walk out of that hall later on with a spring in my step, feeling that there's some hope for this country. So that's what I think he needs to do, to not just lay into the Tories, but actually set out an alternative agenda.
Yeah, I mean, do you agree with that? Have people had enough of the sort of critique of the Conservative government and successive Conservative governments and their record? Does it need to be why us?
Exactly, that's the question Steve's colleagues say this conference is all about answering. If not them, why us? Now, really, that's a bit of a silly question, because in our electoral system, if the public have decided, and the polls look like they have decided, if not them, they have no option really but to pick the Labour Party. But I think if Keir Starmer can get this right today, that's the start of a process, the start of a long campaign where a Labour win might be just that, a Labour win, and not just solely a negative judgment on 13 years of Tory government.
Steve Rotheram, what about for you? What do you think rests on this speech today? I mean, we put so much sort of stall at these annual speeches, but this is a big one for Keir Starmer because it could be his last before a general election.
Of course, and they're really important. I think you'll see stark contrast to what happened last week in Manchester with a speech devoid of any real ideas. And today, as Steve said, I'm hoping that you'll see the culmination of a lot of the hard work that's been going on for many years with those policy ideas, with those, great initiatives that Labour needs, so that we can, get people to understand there is an alternative to austerity and doom and gloom.
One of the questions that sort of looms large, if you like, is over Keir Starmer himself. His approval ratings, whether he is inspiring generations of voters next year in that election. Let's just show you this leader approval ratings. You can see at the bottom there, Rishi Sunak on -24, Keir Starmer ahead, but still on -8, and Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, on -4. Just to give our viewers an idea of what those actually mean, these numbers are net approval ratings. They're calculated from the percentage of respondents to the poll who say they approve of the leader minus the percentage who say they disapprove. That poll was taken last week. We can have a look at the party's state in a moment. But first of all, how problematic is that, Steve?
Well, to be honest, it doesn't surprise me. There's a real pessimism about politics at the moment after the scale of failure that we've seen under this government. Great promises made about initiatives like Brexit that haven't delivered. So people feel pessimistic about politics. And I think what we need to do, given that Labour has transformed itself so far in just 3.5 years since our worst defeat for 85 years, the change is very, very rapid. And I think what we need to do over the next year, starting at this conference, is not just start to introduce what our policies will be, but introduce Keir the man, the person who grew up in a Pebble Dash semi in Oxted, rose by his own hard work to become Director of Public Prosecutions. It's a story of aspiration, and that story can encapsulate the aspiration we have for the British people.
Yeah, but do you think it's catching the imagination of voters, Helen?
To be honest, not yet. So in my job as the North of England editor of The Guardian, I spend a lot of time going round to like so-called red wall seats, cities in the north, and although people are definitely fed up with the Tories, I've yet to encounter voters who are enthusiastic about Keir Starmer. And I think until now there's also been probably the justified criticism that, like, well, what has he got to offer? So if he succeeds today, he'll be offering a really alternative agenda.
I mean, we can show the October poll averages for the state of the parties, and you can see Labour's ahead. It's been ahead comfortably, give or take a few percentage points, for quite a long time. Why isn't that translating into higher approval ratings for Keir Starmer?
The polls haven't moved in a year, basically, in any meaningful sense, and that's because the public have decided they no longer want to be governed by the Conservatives, and that they are fed up with the cost of living crisis. That is a negative judgment on the government. I think Steve is right that this is a public who are broadly disillusioned with politics in general, and you can see why, looking at the approval ratings we just saw, that Conservative strategists think Keir Starmer ultimately in the campaign is their best asset, because this is a public who have not yet been sold on the leader of the Labour Party, even if they want to change the government.
You know Keir Starmer, you talk to him regularly. What advice do you give him, or would you give him, in terms of trying to catch the public's imagination?
Well, I think you'll see a much more animated Keir today in his speech, because there's genuine policy alternatives now coming through the system, and we're not yet in the early stages of a general election. We don't know when that's going to be called, so there's still plenty of time for Keir to improve that. But look, I think the general public have had enough of personality politics. You know, we had during the pandemic a game show host as the Prime Minister of this country making an absolute mess of everything. And then that was followed by a worse Prime Minister, and then possibly followed by an even worse Prime Minister. It's not about personalities, it's about politics. Well,
I mean, that implies that Keir Starmer doesn't really have a personality.
No, it doesn't at all. It means that the public want to see some substance to their politics.
Oh, well, let's talk,
and that's the difference.
Well, let's talk about some of the substance, because you're right, we are going to get some of the flesh on the bones. Well, we hope anyway. Here's the Daily Telegraph. Starmer, I have plans for a decade in power. Well, that's quite bold and ambitious. 2 terms, perhaps, for a Labour government if they win next year. The promises to get Britain building if he wins general election as he delivers his speech. And then this is the headline in The Times, again with a little bit more detail of what might actually happen under Labour. We'll build new towns and Georgian-style homes. Keir Starmer to pledge, Labour leader to promise a big build as part of a decade of national renewal. Where are these new towns going to be, Steve?
Well, I think the really exciting is just how bold that is, given the challenges that you were laying down.
It's only
before.
A headline, though. Of course, actually doing it is very different, as we've discovered.
Yes, that's right. And the way that, well, there's also a big piece in Rachel's speech, Keir's speech today, I'm sure, about devolution. So what we'll be doing is inviting communities, mayors like Steve, combined authorities, to come forward with their own proposals for where they would like these new towns to be, so that we can build the affordable homes British people are crying out for.
Well, are you going to bid for one of these new towns?
So we're already in the process of developing what's called a spatial development strategy, and you need this. So a lot of the hard work is already being done, and that's why things like this, by the way, that's just the headline into Tory supporting periodicals. Actually, the real important thing for me is also alongside that is about council housing and the ability for councils to go and build more housing for people in their communities.
Excuse my cynicism, because I've sat in studios like this for a couple of decades, and planning reform and getting homes built is a lot more difficult than it seems, whoever is in power. So you're in the process, you say the hard work is there. When would this new town appear in your region?
Oh, we haven't got proposals for the new town because this has only been something that's come out now, and we've got 12
but you'll bid
months
for it,
to
but you're
develop.
going to bid for it.
Well, in the 12 months, you can guarantee that we'll put all of those proposals into practice and then see whether there's the possibility of an area in our city region agreeing to be a new town.
Right, well, that's the Mayor of Liverpool. Helen, are you convinced?
I mean, yeah, forgive my scepticism too. If you look at the example of Greater Manchester, so in 2014, they started to develop a spatial framework, and it is still not finished 9 years later. One of the 10 councils in Greater Manchester, Stockport, where I live, they threw their toys out of the pram. They decided they didn't want to play along. It is such a long game. Look at George Osborne. 2014 is when he announced a new town in Ebbsfleet, and that's still not finished.
Steve?
Well, we need a government that's going to be absolutely consistent about infrastructure projects in the way that this government has shown that they absolutely are not. And I think you'll get a lot more consistency and stability from a Keir Starmer-led government that we've seen from the revolving door of Tory administrations over the last few years.
Right, well, consistency is one thing. What practically has to happen in order to ensure, Steve, in the region here, that homes and new towns can be built? How do you get over the problem of developers not actually getting on and building this stuff?
Well, there's a number of things. One of them is about planning policy. Of course it is, and you need a national framework for that. But the second bit is that even if that framework was favourable to areas like ours, because of 13 years of austerity, many councils are being hollowed out, so they don't have the capacity to do some of the planning behind the scenes to get some of these projects over the line.
Right, and there's already resistance. And this is even before Sir Keir Starmer has stood up. And perhaps that's just not surprising. Tony Juniper here from Natural England tweeting, several reports today dismiss Greenbelt as scrubland, the implication being that development on such land is better than what's there now. Truth is that expanding scrub is one of the quickest ways we can make progress for nature recovery. Quite worrying. What are you going to do when there's pushback to your plans?
Well, I think even the environmental groups, and I speak to a lot of them given my current brief, recognise that we need to build the homes where homes are needed and to do it as sustainably as possible. Now, two ways you can do that. First is by brownfield first. That will be part of Keir Starmer's proposal today. There are still many sites, brownfield sites in urban areas that have not been developed because of slow planning processes. So we're looking at a brownfield passport which will speed up planning applications in those areas within agreed parameters to get the spades in the ground and the homes being built. And the second area is looking at what's called grey belt. So the green belt is not all green.
Grey belt.
Some of it, it's where you've got abandoned car parks, abandoned petrol stations. They're not green. They're spaces where housing could be developed and built without causing any environmental damage.
Well,
that is another area that Labour will want to be looking at to get. We have to get building to provide the homes people need.
That I understand.
They come to my advice surgery desperate for somewhere to live.
I do not doubt your ambition and your desire to do these things, but that's just one tweet, even before we've had the detail, Patrick. How are you going to build, even in car parks, on the grey belt that's emerged here at Labour Party conference, without the sort of resistance from, yes, environmental groups and people who don't want houses built near theirs?
Well, look, it will be an immediate test of the resilience and commitment of Keir Starmer to this policy, and whether, look, talk is cheap in opposition.
Yeah.
Labour have been talking about this for a very long time, though, but you're also right, as you said at the very start of this discussion, Joe, to note that every government of either party since Clement Attlee's government passed the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947 has had bold plans for the planning system. as you well know, Steve, when you were opposing Robert Jenrick's planning at the start of this Parliament, right? So there's going to be a lot of vested interest lining up to attack a Labour government. Who knows, if Labour win a big majority, there'll be Labour MPs in rural and semi-rural seats who might not be thrilled. If you get a narrow majority in the Liberal Democrats, the people you're dealing with, and they say to you, well, hang on, we've just won a load of seats in the Tory shires and they don't want building even on the grey belt, what are you going to do then?
Part of the problem has been just how piecemeal development has been under this Conservative government, chopping and changing. It's going to be here, it's going to be there.
But
No one really knows
yes,
what the
but
framework
answer what
is.
Patrick is actually saying about the political resistance you will get.
It's why I think new towns, I mean, Labour's not going to dodge the difficult decisions. There's always going to be a balance of interest, but people need homes to live in that they can afford to buy or rent, and social housing. We need all of that in this country. I think the new homes, the new towns idea is really bold because it gets us away from this piecemeal approach to working with regions and the communities in them to build the homes and the infrastructure where they're needed. That is how you get the transformation in house building we need in this country.
But Helen, you also need amenities and services.
Yes.
I mean, yes, you can build a lovely estate of homes and you can't get anywhere from them.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at what happened last week at the Tory party conference, the cut to HS2, which would have created massive rail capacity in the northwest of England, that's going to be whole communities in Cheshire, over in Liverpool, Manchester.
The funding for the infrastructure comes from a levy on the developers who are doing the building. I chaired.
In theory it does.
I chaired the country's biggest development in the country along the south bank of the Thames, the Vauxhall 9 Elm scheme, and from that, a levy on the developers, we got the extension of the Northern Line. So it can fund huge infrastructure. So of course it can fund the infrastructure we need in the new towns.
Well, Steve, on that point about HS2, are you pleased with what's replacing it, what the current government is promising in terms of the east-west connectivity? All the towns in the north are going to have all sorts of schemes. All the money is going to, not all of it in the north of England, but a lot of it is going to go there. Does that reassure you?
What do you mean, am I pleased about the north again having to choose between things when the south has never had to do that? Am I pleased that all of a sudden the promises about levelling up the country have been thrown out with the cancellation of HS2? Am I pleased about the fact that the supposed 38 billion pounds has now gone to a new geography and the lines on the maps have been completely reconfigured because there's areas down south getting some of the north's money? No, I'm not.
No, well, and are you pleased that Labour's not recommitting or saying it will revive the northern leg of HS2?
Well, actually, we all had a meeting the other night, and that is not what has been said, that they won't.
What has been said?
Well, Labour have quite clearly said that it would be dependent on what is inherited at the time. And the thing
But they could still commit to it, couldn't they? Could still say we have that ambition.
The reason that we can't do that is because if the protections are released, in other words, those safeguarding orders are lifted, then there is no HS2, because once that land is built on, you can't then knock those properties down and build something. And the Tories know this. And the real danger for me is about who that land is going to be sold to.
Right.
And who lost control of the costs in the first place? How did we end up 60 billion
I
pounds
promise you we
overrunning,
did this with the Conservatives last week, but let's think about what Labour is going to do in its place. New powers, more devolution to regions like yours. What do you want from Steve Reid if he's in the Cabinet next year?
Well, I want from a Labour government a fairer distribution of funding. Levelling up was supposed to be about releasing the latent potential of areas like ours, and there's so much that we have to offer this country. Look, if there's a return to Treasury, why wouldn't you fund and invest in areas? And that's been lacking with this Tory government.
But Rachel Reeves, very clear. I mean, you couldn't have doubted her firmness when it came to ironclad discipline on finances. Steve's going to be disappointed, I think, isn't he?
Well, I mean, there are some really good proposals coming forward around devolution. What we want to do is give local areas, local mayors like Steve, combined authorities, the powers they need to turbocharge their own local economies over skills, over infrastructure, over broadband, over public transport. That way they can drive investment in their areas, bring in the good jobs that the people living there will need.
You might have those powers, but no extra money.
Well, the way you get extra money is by growing the economy. And quite clearly, Rachel Reeves has identified that we're the only party serious in growing the economy.
But that will take time. I mean, what do you think about these new powers, devolution? Is it really going to change what Steve Rotherham can do in the region of Liverpool?
Well, I think it's broadly positive, but what I think Labour needs to address is what they're going to do about local government finances, which we know have been absolutely ruined over the past 10 years. How much did you lose in Liverpool, Steve? Like 200 million, something like that?
More than that.
And I think Labour so far, unless I've missed it, has been pretty silent on whether they're going to increase government grants. Because, when Rachel Reeves said yesterday, Rachel Reeves said, has anything got better in the last 13 years? And if you think about the services that most people use every day, they're actually things that the councils control. Swimming pools, litter, All these kind of
This is why Keir Starmer's talking about a 10-year plan to rebuild Britain. You cannot fix 13 years of failure and decline overnight.
Right.
We're going to need to grow the economy. We're going to need to turbocharge local economies across the country to really level up this
Are you
country.
going to give money back to local councils, do you think?
We're going to have to grow the economy, but we can give them the powers to get control of their own destinies in a way that has not been possible under this Conservative government. It's shocking to me that many of the poorest regions in Europe are in England. That's because we haven't given those regions the powers they need. It's not a shortage of talent or ambition on the part of those people. It's a shortage of power to control their own destinies.
Things aren't going to change immediately if Labour win next year, are they? We're talking now 10-year plans. We're talking about or undoing 13 years of Conservative ruin of the economy, as our guests see it. If you're struggling with bills and cost of living right now, it's not going to change, is it, for several months at the very least?
That's the thing I think that is missing from everything Keir Starmer has said hitherto, and what he really needs to address in his speech today, or start to address. I think the really interesting thing about the by-election Labour won at a canter in Scotland last week is that the language they were using was not the sort of bloodless, clinical, technocratic language that you see in the 5 missions about the highest sustained growth in the G7. I mean, nobody's talking about that,
in the pub.
Yeah, exactly. In the Baltic Fleet over the road,
Yeah.
which is a great pub, by the way. But Keir Starmer was talking about jobs, making work pay, expressing this in tangible language that people could understand. And I think that is something that's been missing, and perhaps Keir could do that today.
Well, let's return to the subject of building and planning and how easy it will be for a Labour government if it wins the election next year to actually put in place some of its ambition and vision, because already there is a lot of opposition to power lines, particularly in the east of England. Let's have a listen to the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves on Radio 4 yesterday responding to that.
Look, we need to see this investment because otherwise bills are going to stay high. We're going to be reliant on Russia and the Middle East for our basic energy needs. And I do want to do more to make, do and sell here in Britain. But when communities host infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, they should get some benefit, including with lower bills.
Well, that was Rachel Reeves responding. We're joined now by Rosie Pearson, founder of the Community Planning Alliance. She's currently opposing plans to build a 112-mile-long power line across East Anglia. Rosie, welcome to you. In her speech yesterday, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, talked a lot about how Labour would get Britain building. She set out plans to rewire Britain, which would involve thousands of new electricity pylons and cables running across the countryside. What did you make of it?
Well, look, as a group, we are really supportive. Obviously, the grid needs to be upgraded. The country is moving to electric goods and so on a lot more than before, but it's got to be done the right way. And pylons are a sort of dinosaur technology. So we as a campaign group, we're opposing the pylons that cross through East Anglia because there's a better option. And that option is offshore, where the wind power is generated to create a grid. And it should take the power from the wind farms down to London and the south where it's needed. So what we're calling for is a proper strategic grid, which actually, instead of the piecemeal approach we get at the moment that's so damaging, is cheaper for consumers than what's happening currently. And there's reports that show it'll be £2 billion cheaper for the east of England to have an integrated offshore grid than to continue as we are now with the damaging approach.
Right, Rosie, you will have heard Rachel Reeves also offering sweeteners to people like you and campaign groups like yours. That might mean lower bills. Would that convince you to row in and support her plans?
No. Sweeteners, or benefits as the Conservatives call them, are a red herring. They won't speed up infrastructure. They are trying to essentially bribe communities to accept the wrong infrastructure in many cases. And they're a mere pittance against the problems that people have. So farmers with the issues around farming with pylons, people who cannot sell their houses at the moment, we're seeing it already with the blight of the pylons. They don't get compensation. No one's offering them compensation. They're offering them a few pounds off their bill. So it's almost an insult to these communities to hear politicians saying that sweeteners and benefits like a playground for your village will make up for the damage to your community.
Rosie Pearson, thank you very much. Well, there's some opposition already, very firmly set out. They don't want those pylons in their backyard.
Labour's not going to duck the difficult decisions. What
How are you going to deal with Rosie?
What we want to happen is Britain to take back control of our own energy by investing in wind, wave, solar, nuclear. But to get that energy where it's required, we will need to upgrade infrastructure. Now, in some cases, that will be modernising in existing infrastructure, but obviously where you've got a new energy production or generating facility, there will need to be capacity to transport it to where it needs to be. If you've got a farmer who's building a wind energy scheme on their land, they will need infrastructure to get the surplus energy into the national grid. So it will have to happen. I think it's right to do it in concert with communities, and they will have a right to have a say.
And if they say
before it
no,
happens, but there will also be benefits to those communities in the form of lower bills, as Rachel was talking about. I think people understand if you're generating energy, you've got to get it to the people who need to use it. Otherwise, it's pointless generating.
What about an offshore grid that Rosie was talking about?
Well, we'll look at all of the options. Of course, we will. But new infrastructure is needed after a decade and a half of underinvestment from the Conservatives.
Patrick, I mean, that...
I think the ultimate measure of Labour's seriousness about this stuff in government will be whether it ignores people like that, because there will be no shortage of voices who are opposed to any sort of development anywhere. And what's been really striking about this conference is that planning is Labour's economic policy. Building is Labour's economic policy. Without it, that cupboard is pretty bare. But there'll be no shortage of voices like that, articulate critics of any development, with lots of friends in the media. And we'll see just what kind of a Prime Minister Keir Starmer can be if he is prepared to say no, which I think is what Steve was too diplomatic to say there.
Yeah, and will the government carry the can, or will they leave it to local councils, who often end up being the bogeymen in these kind of discussions, I think?
Well, as a former councillor, I can't remember an application coming to our planning committee that wasn't opposed by somebody, so you're always going to get that. And look, on energy generation and energy security, we've got ambitious plans here in the Liverpool City region, and just to perhaps point out, I'm the mayor of the Liverpool City region, not the mayor of Liverpool.
We know. We're using shorthand.
And you're using shorthand. That causes confusion out with my electorate. But we've got ambitious plans for a Mersey tidal scheme, offshore, onshore, geothermal.
But Steve, would you say no? If there was a Rosie Pearson in your backyard, in your region, would you say no, I'm sorry, we're just going to ignore your concerns, or we'll talk to you, then ignore your concerns and pile ahead with the pylon?
Well, I know now that if we were to get the funding available so that we could do this Mersey tidal project, there will be objections for some people, and you have to look at the greater good at times. And for us in the Liverpool City region, this could be transformational to our fortunes and start and rebuild what we want to do with digital and life sciences and all the wonderful things we're doing here. But energy production would be really pivotal to all of that.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about energy and show you this tweet, because this was in response to a motion that was passed yesterday. It's from the campaign group Momentum, the tweet is, who are on the left of the party. And it says, in response to yesterday, Labour conference backs public ownership of energy and rail. Members and unions just voted to send the leadership a message. It's time to end the failed privatisation agenda. So, conference have voted to renationalise energy and rail. Will that be Labour's policy if you're elected?
No, it won't be.
Why not?
Because what we want to do, Momentum are very much a fringe operation now.
What about all the people that voted
operation.
for the motion yesterday?
What people are expressing is their dissatisfaction with the way that the system is working now. With energy, Labour's proposing to set up GB Energy, which is a publicly owned company that will be directing public and private investment into wind, wave, solar, nuclear, sustainable forms of energy, so that we have a more secure energy supply but can cut household energy bills. You'll find no one in this conference that disagrees with all of that, because it's real help to working people at a time of a cost of living crisis, and it's benefiting nature and the environment as well. We're all on the same side on that.
Right, but it wasn't that long ago, was it, that Keir Starmer himself believed in the idea of nationalising key utilities? I mean, this was when he was standing to be leader. Number 5 of his 10 pledges is here. Common ownership. Public services should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders. Support common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water. End outsourcing in our NHS, local government and justice system. What's changed?
Joe, if we junked what I just described, which is Labour's policy expressed yesterday by Rachel Reeves, if we junked it, we would delay the generation of sustainable energy, we would keep bills higher, and we'd spend billions of pounds untangling the existing system rather than tackling the problem facing people today. We'd make ourselves irrelevant, so we're not going to do it.
Right, but it's not just people on the fringe, because Steve Rotherham is here, and admittedly last year you tweeted this. Call it common sense, socialism in action, levelling up or whatever you like. I call it the right thing to do. We Own It poll finds red wall voters massively favour nationalisation, and you can see the percentages there. Can you persuade Steve Reed for the case for nationalisation?
Well, I'll be putting that case forward because whilst I would never ever want to be either the leader of the Labour Party or the Prime Minister of this country, so that will prevent me from doing some of those things locally, I am the Metro Mayor. And we've taken our buses back into public control, and we are taking our railways back into public control, and we, as the people in the Liverpool City region, have bought our own rolling stock. So there are things that you can do, and we're doing that with the powers that we currently have.
Can you persuade Steve perhaps that could be expanded beyond what you're doing?
It's being
Well, I
expanded.
think
Well, what
the rails-
Steve's done with buses here,
And
Labour's
indeed-
going to roll out to every single town in the country. Why shouldn't they own their own
What
buses?
about utilities?
Andy's doing the same in Greater Manchester, and you're right about we can roll this out right the way across the country. They're the most important things. But for me, the rail system is too fragmented. You know, not just about HS2 not being built, which is an absolute nightmare, about the fact that you can't really get west to east very easily, and it's very expensive. I would take the railways back, but as I say, I'm not the Prime Minister.
No,
and I'll be
you're an
persuading.
you're an important person in the Labour Party.
I'll be
will you
persuading colleagues of my argument on why this is the best thing to do.
Right. Is it going to fall on deaf ears, though?
What, with this Labour leadership?
Yes.
Almost certainly, at least when the economy is in the state it's in. I think the real political risk for the Labour Party here, though, is the picture of Keir Starmer's leadership pledge that you just flashed up. Now, and it all comes back to the poll we saw about personal ratings of Keir Starmer. If there is, the sliver of an opening for the Conservatives to narrow the polls and pull Labour back to a hung parliament, it is by saying Keir Starmer's making lots and lots of bold promises about his 10-year plan, about reforming the planning system like no Prime Minister has done before. Remember the promises he made to the Labour membership. Remember the promises he made to the 48% of people who voted Remain, etc., etc. Look at how that ended. That's a political risk. I don't think it's going to swing an election, but it is a risk over the course of a campaign.
I just think your average person has got no idea that he ever made 5 pledges. I pay attention to politics and I couldn't name 5 of them.
10.
Well,
10, sorry.
5 missions now.
I don't know.
Again,
I think that there is an acceptance among the general public that things have changed. Like post-COVID, things have changed. Our finances are in a different situation. And I think although your average person would support the renationalisation of pretty much all utilities and so forth, when they're landed then with a bill for tens, hundreds of millions, billions of pounds to these private companies, then they might not support them so much.
Right, well, let's talk about bills, taxpayers having to foot the bills for water companies. Steve, you tweeted this. Labour will give the water regulator new powers to ban bonuses for water bosses who dump toxic sewage into our waterways. It's a particularly salient issue at the moment. With Labour, the polluter, not the public, will pay. If you want to put an end to the bonuses and the sewage discharges, why not nationalise the water industry?
Because it would cost over £80 billion and take years to untangle the current model of ownership. And what people are seeing, and that infuriates them today, is record levels of sewage in our waterways and our rivers and our lakes, lapping up onto our beaches, putting their kids' health at risk. Last year, the highest level of illegal sewage discharges in our country's history, and yet the water company bosses paying themselves nearly £10 million in bonuses for their success in achieving that. I'm not going to allow that to happen if I'm the Environment Secretary.
But we now know from the water companies themselves that consumers are facing an increase in bills of £156 a year to pay for improvements which will reduce those sewage outflows. Would Labour, under you, if you're sitting in the Cabinet, block the planned increase in bills?
What I don't want to happen is people to pay extra on their bills and then it go in bonuses to water bosses that have failed to fix the infrastructure.
They will still pay the extra in their bill.
What I'll need to do, I'll sit down with the water companies. We will look at a very long-term plan for how we fix the infrastructure that the Tories have let crumble. But we're going to put the water companies under special measures. There's going to be severe and automatic fines for every illegal sewage discharge, personal criminal liability for water bosses who don't take action against these criminal acts that the companies they're responsible for are taking, and powers to Ofwat as the regulator to block bonuses to water bosses who are failing to keep our waterways clean.
And they are eye-watering, the bonuses, the dividends. You're absolutely right.
£10 million.
According to the Financial Times, they paid out £1.4 billion in dividends last year. But how will you stop those firms? You might stop the bonuses, passing on the cost then to bill payers.
Because what will happen if instead of giving excessive dividends or bonuses to their senior executives, we will force them through the imposition of these severe fines to invest in improving the infrastructure so they don't get fined anymore. That way we can keep bills low and water clean, and that is how Labour will do it. The polluter will pay, not the consumer with Labour. It's not what you see under the Tories.
Do you think nationalising the water industry would be a good way to go?
I agree with Steve on this particular one, that it would take just an extraordinary length of time to get these water companies and out of the contracts that we currently have with them, and then to find the quantum of money necessary to buy them back. But you can work with local water companies. In our area, United Utilities have discharged hundreds, if not thousands of times into the River Mersey.
Yeah.
I've got an agreement for a discharge-free River Mersey by 2030, and we're looking at the investment strategy now, working together, and how we can prevent that.
I mean, one of the interesting things the government says to counter some of the arguments here is that actually we only know how much sewage is going in because they were the ones who put in the facilities to measure the amount of sewage. Do you think that sort of, well, holds water?
No, it's the short answer. I don't think voters are going to thank them for that.
Thank you for telling us how much sewage you're dumping into our waterways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, God bless them.
I mean, Helen, this is an issue that a lot of MPs say fills up their post bags endlessly. But the idea that you might have to pay even more in the coming years to pay for the water companies to make the improvements that people feel they should have done over the last decade is going to be difficult.
Yeah, it's going to be a bitter pill to swallow, but I think it's smart politics from Labour. I think it's an absolute guaranteed vote winner, because who could, with a straight face, do anything other than support making our rivers, our seas cleaner?
And yet the Conservatives in power for 13 years haven't done it. You know, it's time for common sense government, isn't it?
And by the way, it's not just the people who are counting, or the water companies who put these counters in. It's people who've been campaigners like Fergal Sharkey and all of those wonderful people who've brought this to the top of the political agenda.
I mean, there is still this question of how a Labour government will fund the things that they want to do, particularly with public services, slight break from utilities, when there isn't much money around.
Well, I think the most significant thing we heard from Rachel Reeves yesterday, be it on stations like the BBC or in her speech to conference yesterday, was something that she didn't necessarily shout about, but there was a significant rhetorical shift. Rachel Reeves is now willing to talk about using an interventionist industrial strategy, using the power of the state to borrow to invest. Now that is an argument for obvious reasons the Labour leadership have been very nervous about making, but it's a sign of their confidence, but also a sign of the awareness that the public need some sign that the Labour Party is going to spend the money on big transformative projects. And even if it's just Rachel Reeves saying we will prime the pump for private sector investment, for long-term investment, it is hugely significant. She said that yesterday, and it's of a piece with the planning stuff. It's easy to say this Labour leadership is timid, it's cautious, it's scared of its own shadow. But in those two economic offers, we have the makings, potentially, of some quite bold policy. But let's see if it survives.
Well, let's get a flavour of what some of the delegates gathered here and queuing up outside the conference hall want to hear from Sir Keir Starmer. My colleague, BBC political correspondent Leila Nathu, is catching up with a few of them.
Joe, we are here just by the side of the queue. You can see it snaking all the way back to the end of the exhibition hall behind me. So plenty of people here in a lot of good time, actually. You know, still more than an hour to go before Keir Starmer's speech starts. But there are some lovely, willing people here willing to talk to us about what they want to hear. You've queued up so early. Why so early? Eager anticipation?
Well, definitely. I mean, this is on the cusp of, you know, an ex-Labour government as far as we're all concerned. I mean, Keir's going to basically lay out the plans for the next 5 years. You know, it's basically an election manifesto. I mean, Rachel Reeves gave a fabulous speech the other day, you know, sensible economic policies. You know, and that's what we're here to say. It just feels like we're really on the cusp of power, and we're all here to witness it, really.
On the cusp of power?
Definitely. I believe it's time for a Labour government. We need to end austerity. We've got working families who are attending food banks, and that has to stop.
Has Keir Starmer done enough to convey that vision, do you think, or do you need to hear more from him today?
I think we need to hear more from him, and at the end of the day, no child should be going hungry. So I think we need to start campaigning for free school meals for all children, so that every child has got a full belly. Without a full belly, you don't learn.
And are there any specific policies you want to hear Keir Starmer talk about today?
I think we've spoken about, the violence against women and girls, which is really important to us as well, about the devolution down to local government, where 3 Labour local councillors in the North East area, and I think that's really important to us, to give us the powers, but also give us the financial resource that we need, and that we're not to blame for the limited resource that we have been given. So we're really excited. It's all of our, well, it's not Pamela's first conference, but it's ours, and we're just making the very best. We've literally been in and out of all of the fringe events and in the conference hall, and we're just really excited.
Are you new members, or is this just your first conference?
No, just
first conference, but you can feel the atmosphere, the buzz. It's electric because you know why? Everybody believes that he is the next leader. And it's going to happen next year. Watch this space.
Wow. Okay, so there you have it. Some conference newbies eagerly anticipating Keir Starmer's speech. Let's have a little walk down the line a little bit to this young gentleman here. What are you hoping to hear from Keir Starmer in his speech?
Housing reform, the devolution that he's sort of been briefed about. I want to see the education system completely overhauled. I want prices to go down, as sort of Rachel Reeves laid out in her excellent speech yesterday.
Have you been impressed with what you've heard from Keir Starmer so far? He's talking today about a decade of national renewal.
Yeah, I am very impressed, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, one happy customer here. Last few voices we'll get from the queue here, this lady here. What do you want to hear from Keir Starmer in this speech? You're queuing up early.
I go knocking on people's doors to ask them to vote Labour. I want to hear straight from him, how are we supposed to sell Labour to the electorate? I don't want to hear it second-hand. I want it straight from the horse's mouth. So that if he doesn't fulfill his promises, I can quote him and say, you said.
I see, okay, there we go. Plenty of demands from Keir Starmer here in the queue. One canvasser saying he needs to give us something to sell. That is exactly what Keir Starmer needs to do.
Leila Nathu there talking to delegates waiting patiently outside for the speech, which we're expecting to start at about 2 o'clock. We're coming off air at 1 o'clock. You can see there people filing in. Are they taking sweets in before they go in? They'll need some sustenance, no doubt, for the hour-long speech we're expecting from Keir Starmer. We'll be back on air covering the speech at 1:45 until 1:45. So please do join us then. I mean, listening to the excitement, Helen, the optimism. I mean, times they have changed at Labour Party conference. I mean, you can say that Keir Starmer has transformed his party, certainly.
Yeah, and just in a year, well, I was here a year ago when Labour was in Liverpool, and it was not, the atmosphere was nothing like this.
No.
I mean, it's absolutely packed. I think it's great that people are excited about politics and there's that optimism, because as I said at the start of the show, that hope is what's been lacking, and that's what people need.
I mean, even down to that campaigner there in the queue saying, I need to know the lines to tell people when I knock on the doors. I mean, they're ready, aren't they?
They're ready, but I also think that speaks to, even within the party, a sense that Labour does not yet have that snappy message.
Yeah.
I think it's coming. We'll hear the germ of it from Keir Starmer later. I'd also just push back gently against what Helen said. Everybody's excited here because this is a party that knows it's going to be in government for the first time in 13 years. You've got lots of people who are excited to be surrounded by the next Secretary of State for the Environment, for instance. But are the general public really excited about politics and the political process?
Well,
are they not incredibly disillusioned and despondent?
It's not a done deal. You know, I do not assume I'm going to be the next Secretary of State for the Environment. We have to earn every single vote. And I thought what was really great about that delegate there, she didn't want to talk to Labour. She wanted to get on the doorsteps and talk to the voters. That is the real feeling that we need in this party. We are the British People's Party, and we're going to set out an agenda that they will take a decision on as to whether we should then have the right to govern this great country.
I mean, is there a problem of triumphalism at all? If people just assume, as those delegates perhaps rightly feel, it's in the bag?
There's always a problem if people believe that it's already a done deal and they don't have to go out and knock on those doors and take those messages out. But this is in stark contrast to what I witnessed last week, and that was the death throes of a zombie government. This is a real buzz about what the future can be, and we will provide hope for the future for everyone in Britain.
Well, that is a good note to say goodbye to our guests for this programme. I will be back in 45 minutes' time to bring coverage and analysis of Keir Starmer's speech to conference. Bye-bye for now. Make a cup of tea.